thousands of farmers descended onto Westminster, protesting proposed changes to inheritance tax, a death tax.
Over 1,200 tractors mobilised at once. 42 major arteries completely deadlocked, and nearly 135,000 farmers across Britain have finally reached their breaking point over the so-called death tax. At 5:50 p.m, 3 massive columns were spotted advancing from the provinces along 2 primary highways. In just 11 minutes, multiple city streets were completely occupied by agricultural forces. A chilling ultimatum was delivered. We are giving you 72 hours or you will be completely without food. Instantly, 6 elite police units were deployed to barricade the remaining routes. 6:12 p.m, over 100 pieces of heavy agricultural machinery initiated the breach. Nearby, police cordons maintained the illusion of control right up until the beginning of the end. 26 miles away, protesters unloaded over 200 litres of manure onto administrative buildings, and here is exactly why farmers are effectively at war with Starmer. Prior to 2026, when the head of a family died and the children inherited a UK farm, they had to pay absolutely zero. But due to the legislation passed in recent months, the heir to an average farm now faces a tax bill of up to £1,500,000, despite their earnings being 10 times less. That is why, at 6:30 p.m. sharp, hundreds of farmers from neighbouring regions joined the surge. Suddenly, dozens of long-haul trucks were spotted simultaneously across 4 major highways. With farmers already holding the streets, the threat of a massive coordinated blockade became imminent. Instantly, analysts issued a grim projection. Food supplies on shelves could run out within 72 hours. And this is no exaggeration. If these threats materialise, Tesco chains across the entire country will be stripped of basic provisions. By 6:51 p.m, the first footage of completely paralysed logistical arteries surfaced. Dozens of new police vans arrived, their lights flashing uselessly in the gridlock. Authorities issued a warning. Blocking government districts will result in up to a year in prison. But in just 11 minutes, nobody cared anymore. The first fires were spotted in 3 districts simultaneously. Rioters began burning tyres and chemical waste directly on the streets. 4 miles away, the No Farmers No Food convoy smashed right through police barricades. The heavily equipped tractors were practically impossible to stop. At 7:05 p.m, Starmer was officially branded public enemy number 1. So-called far-right waves began flooding into the cities. Clashes with frontline officers erupted across 5 separate sectors simultaneously. Now, overwhelmed authorities were forced to battle furious farmers and political rioters at the exact same time. Starmer's opposition in Parliament had repeatedly warned that legislative shifts over the past 12 months would ignite a nationwide rebellion. Intelligence analysts calculated that disgruntled agricultural associations issued between 8 and 12 explicit warnings across their social media platforms before mobilising. Yet Downing Street stood absolutely firm, insisting that reversing the so-called death tax was never part of their agenda. British PM endlessly repeats the same speech, claiming a £20 billion financial black hole must be filled immediately. Consequently, this rigid stance made the situation 5 times worse on the ground. Furious rural workers and so-called far-right groups instantly transitioned from digital complaints to physical actions. Local authorities recorded a staggering 460% surge in regional social tension within mere weeks. Opposition leader Nigel Farage publicly explains this fracture by accusing the Premier of stealing from the very people who have fed Britain for centuries. He claims these extracted funds are being redirected to sponsor up to 1,000 undocumented men arriving daily on small boats to the UK. Citizens from London to Belfast are now asking the exact same question. They wonder how Starmer easily finds £8 million a day for migrant hotels while simultaneously slaughtering ordinary citizens with confiscatory taxes. A typical farmer's son, whose family inherited the exact same soil for 16 consecutive generations without penalty, now faces sudden financial ruin. In response, Treasury officials coldly explain that agricultural land remains highly valuable. Bureaucrats argue that an average working estate, complete with tractors, barns and livestock, easily reaches a valuation of £10 million. However, political rivals fiercely accuse the cabinet of deliberate statistical manipulation. The harsh reality dictates that British food producers are incredibly wealthy on paper, but practically destitute in daily life. Financial records prove that these vital enterprises yield barely a 1% annual return on their total massive valuation. This mathematical absurdity is exactly why an estimated nearly 135,000 agricultural workers feel fundamentally betrayed by their own leadership. Without any viable options left, these essential labourers realised that polite lobbying was entirely useless. Their defensive strategy quickly morphed into an aggressive siege mentality. Rural communities genuinely believe they are being intentionally bankrupted to fund failing metropolitan projects. Economic forecasters predict up to 25,000 peripheral jobs in the countryside will vanish if these family businesses collapse under the new levies. Equipment vendors, local veterinarians, and seed suppliers are already preparing for a devastating market crash. Meanwhile, supermarket executives quietly panic over the sudden vulnerability of the domestic supply chain. Currently, the United Kingdom produces only 60% of the food it consumes, leaving virtually no margin for error. Bankrupting even a tenth of these legacy estates will trigger an unprecedented reliance on foreign imports. Angry crowds entirely ignore promises of future subsidies, viewing them as a pathetic distraction from the immediate tax theft. Starmer's politicians originally sold this policy as a righteous strike against London oligarchs hoarding farmland to dodge inheritance duties. Instead, actual billionaires easily bypass the new rules using expensive corporate trusts and offshore tax lawyers. Those caught in the crossfire are simply regular families who lack the liquid cash to hire elite financial consultants. Precisely this specific brand of Keir Starmer's leadership serves as the ultimate catalyst for the storming of our streets. Crowds comprised not only of desperate farmers but also furious local residents are now completely disillusioned with the current administration. Recent polling indicates that anywhere from 70 to 75% of Britons nationwide demand the resignation of the Prime Minister. We are witnessing this exact boiling point overflowing onto the turbulent streets of Belfast. Local citizens in Northern Ireland have finally crossed the threshold of their political patience. During the massive "Enough is Enough" demonstrations, dozens of vehicles and several migrant accommodation centres were systematically set ablaze. Across certain deeply fractured neighbourhoods, the intensity of civil unrest has multiplied fourfold in a matter of days. Never in the past 2 decades has the domestic population been this aggressively enraged by state policies. So-called sanctuary hotels now face a daily, escalating threat of arson from completely exhausted communities. Mainstream media networks are operating at absolute maximum capacity to brand these drained citizens as dangerous far-right extremists. Broadcast reports focus exclusively on violent clashes with riot police and the dozens of injured officers left on the pavement. Somehow, those same news anchors conveniently forget to mention that a new machete or zombie knife attack occurs every 10 minutes. Journalists ignore the terrifying reality that young women practically cannot step outside safely after 8 o'clock in the evening. Letting children play unsupervised in urban parks has become an unthinkable risk for modern British parents. Nigel Farage publicly asserts that grooming gangs are reaching absolute peak operational activity right at this very moment. He explicitly highlights specific demographic groups that are statistically 14 times more likely to commit horrific sexual offences. The outspoken politician directly accuses Starmer of deliberately suppressing critical data regarding the origins of these violent perpetrators. In response, Downing Street fiercely denies any correlation between cultural backgrounds and the staggering spike in violent assaults. Cabinet ministers do cautiously admit that the overall criminal situation requires urgent, systemic resolution. However, the Prime Minister absolutely refuses to connect the daily arrival of thousands of undocumented men on small boats to the deteriorating safety of British cities. His standard defence mechanism involves blaming the collapsing infrastructure on an inherited, broken system rather than his own open border policies. Political opponents who dare to raise these urgent demographic questions are immediately smeared with accusations of racism and bigotry. Critics say labelling concerned taxpayers as right-wing agitators has become the default strategy of a government terrified of public accountability. Working-class families watch in sheer disbelief as their neighbourhoods are fundamentally transformed without their consent. Billions of taxpayer pounds are continuously diverted to fund the logistics of an endless illegal migration wave. Meanwhile, those same taxpayers are told there is absolutely no money left to protect multi-generational family farms from ruin. Such a glaring double standard naturally pushes ordinary, law-abiding citizens past the point of rational debate. People standing in endless hospital waiting rooms see newly arrived individuals receiving immediate emergency processing. Social housing waiting lists stretch into decades, while entire commercial hotel chains are block booked by the Home Office overnight. Rural communities and urban centres are finally finding common ground in their shared abandonment by the Westminster elite. Agricultural workers blocking highways with tractors and urban mothers protesting outside town halls share the exact same deep-rooted grievance. Both groups clearly recognise that the state apparatus no longer serves the interests of the native population. Police forces seem incredibly well equipped to arrest a citizen for an offensive online post within hours. Yet those same constabularies claim they lack the resources to intercept a coordinated robbery happening in broad daylight. Officers paralysed by diversity and inclusion guidelines actively avoid making arrests in certain highly sensitive community zones. Criminal syndicates fully understand this institutional weakness and exploit it with ruthless, military-level precision. London's Metropolitan Authority operates under a paralysing fear of causing offence rather than a mandate to enforce the law. Just last week, internal memos revealed instructions to prioritise community cohesion over aggressive suspect apprehension. Retreat at the first sign of racial tension. Ordinary shopkeepers are left entirely defenceless against flash mobs that strip their shelves bare in minutes. Desperate business owners who attempt to physically defend their property frequently find themselves facing assault charges instead of the actual thieves. Justice in modern Britain increasingly feels like a weapon wielded exclusively against the productive, tax-paying middle class. Starmer's cabinet firmly believes that strict taxation and cultural appeasement will somehow magically balance the nation's fragile equations. Critics argue that appeasing hostile networks only invites further, more aggressive subversion of British sovereignty. Every single day, without decisive governmental action, translates to another neighbourhood slipping out of local control. Analysts reviewing the timeline of national decline point directly to the simultaneous failure of border security and domestic law enforcement. Communities that previously never experienced organised crime are now dealing with sophisticated extortion and drug-running operations. Frustrated citizens are increasingly forming their own neighbourhood watch patrols to fill the dangerous void left by retreating state forces. These organic grassroots defence initiatives are immediately heavily scrutinised by intelligence agencies looking for right-wing extremism. Trust between the electorate and the ruling political class has essentially evaporated into absolute nothingness. Farming syndicates warn that if the food supply chain snaps, the urban chaos will multiply into an uncontrollable, famine-driven panic. Supermarket executives secretly brief the cabinet that their logistical margins cannot survive a simultaneous farmer strike and urban riot. Treasury officials stubbornly refuse to acknowledge that their taxation models are directly fueling a catastrophic social implosion. Foreign observers watch in utter shock as a former global empire struggles to maintain basic order on its own capital streets. European neighbours silently tighten their own border controls, fearing the imminent spillover of Britain's domestic collapse. Keir Starmer remains entirely convinced that sophisticated public relations statements can somehow rewrite the grim reality visible from every window. Speeches about national renewal echo hollowly against the backdrop of burning tyres, blocked ports, and shattered storefronts. History frequently demonstrates that populations deprived of both safety and sustenance will eventually bypass the ballot box altogether. This ongoing convergence of rural economic destruction and urban lawlessness represents a perfect, unprecedented political storm.